Hey, we're starting a new series. It's called the Peacemaker Series. I'm using as a source for the series this book called The Peacemaker by Ken Sande. A number of things will be taken from the book as far as certain outlines and some terminology and so on, and then putting it into scriptural stories and contexts and so on. But I want to be careful to be sure to give Ken the credit along the way, and so grateful for his wisdom and for this book, because I think it's a crucial book for any age, but I think especially for the times that we're living in. And so I want to get this series onto video format as well. I want to begin with a story, page 17 of The Peacemaker. "Don't you try to come in," Frank yelled through the door. "I have a bat, and I'll hit anyone who comes in." "Oh, come on, Frank. Open the door," Joe responded from the porch. "We just want to talk." "This is getting out of control," Jenny said as she pulled at Joe's arm. "I think we should call our lawyer and have him talk with Frank." "But the realtor and the buyer will be here in 10 minutes. The deal will fall apart if they can't get in to look at the house." "It'll fall apart a lot worse if Frank goes after them with a bat. I'm going to call right now and postpone the meeting until we can do something with Frank," she said. "Okay, but I won't let him hold up this sale forever, Jenny. You've got 2 days to get him out of there, and after that I'll come back with my own baseball bat. I'm sure John and Matt will be happy to join me." Joe stormed over to his car and drove out of the farmyard, venting his anger by spinning a wave of gravel across the yard. As Jenny drove back to town, she felt utterly trapped between her 4 brothers. Ever since their mother had died, they had been fighting over the farm. Frank had been born with a disability that had kept him at home all of his life. In the early years, their mother had cared for him, but as her health failed, Frank became the caregiver, rarely leaving her side. When she finally succumbed to a massive stroke, Frank's world collapsed. Things got worse when their mother's will was read. She and their dad had established a trust many years earlier to provide for Frank. In their wills, they left the farm equally to their other 4 children. Now that both parents were dead, Joe, John, and Matt wanted to sell the property as quickly as possible. When they told Frank, he was terrified at the prospect of moving out of the only home he had ever lived in. As he resisted the idea, heated arguments ensued, and now Frank was cornered in the lonely farmhouse. Although Jenny needed the money from the sale as much as her brothers did, she did not like the idea of forcibly evicting Frank. The 3 brothers were oblivious to his fears and determined to push ahead. Jenny felt powerless to stop them. I want to begin this series with this idea. It's the idea that conflict brings opportunities to make peace. From Ephesians 4, verses 1 to 3, "I, therefore, the prisoner for the Lord, urge you to live worthily of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." Conflict brings opportunities to make peace. Ken Sande talks about this in 3 ways. Actually, 3 ways that people handle or try to deal with conflict. One of the main ways is just to escape. Another way that people deal with conflict is to attack. And a third way to deal with conflict that we will be focusing on over this series is the idea of making peace in conflict. Let me go on with our story for a couple more minutes. Jenny felt powerless to stop her brothers. Then she remembered that her pastor had recently attended a seminar on biblical peacemaking. A brief call to him led to a meeting that night, which resulted in an intense discussion with 3 of her brothers. "Look, Pastor," Joe said, "I'm only asking that we honor Mom's wishes and follow the law. She and Dad decided years ago to set up a trust for Frank and divide the farm among the rest of us. As personal representative for her estate, it's my legal responsibility to honor her will. I know it will be a little bit hard on Frank to move out, but there's a nice apartment complex in town. He'll settle in there in no time." "But it could kill him," Jenny insisted. "Losing Mom devastated Frank. If we force him out of the house, he will lose everything that's familiar to him. I'm afraid of what it will do to him." "So what do we do?" Matt interjected. "Just sit around until he dies years from now and then finally divide up the property? I've got 2 kids in college, and if Mom were here, I'm sure she'd want to see the farm sold to help them out. I agree with Joe. We should honor Mom's will and follow the law." "I appreciate your respect for your mother and for the law," said Pastor Barry. "But there's something else to consider. All of you profess to be Christians, so what is the difference between the way you are handling this conflict and the way a good atheist would handle it?" After several moments of awkward silence, Joe finally replied, "I'm not sure I see your point." "Let me put it another way," Pastor said. "What is more important to you in this situation? To get your money as soon as possible, as most people would, or to demonstrate the love of Christ to your brother?" "Oh, I see," said John. "You want us to be good little Christians who just give in to others and walk away from what's rightfully ours." "No, that's not what I'm saying. God loves justice, and he certainly wants you to respect your parents' wishes, but there is something he wants even more: to see you treating one another in a way that shows the power of the gospel in each of your lives." "Well, that sounds good, Pastor," Joe replied, "but I just don't see how religion applies to this problem." "If you really want to know, let's pray together right now and ask God to show you how you can resolve this conflict in a way that honors him and fulfills your parents' wishes. Conflict brings with it opportunities to make peace. There are 3 ways that people generally try to resolve conflict or deal with conflict: escape, attack, and make peace. Let's talk briefly about each of these 3, and then we'll wrap up. First, escape. People tend to use these kinds of responses when they're more interested in avoiding a conflict than resolving it, says Ken Sande. So 3 ways that people try to escape the conflict. One is denial, right? Some of you might remember the story in the Bible of Abraham, Sarai, yes, and her servant Hagar. And the idea that Abraham and Sarah had been promised a child, but there was no child coming. And so finally, Sarah said, "Well, maybe you're supposed to have a child by my servant girl, Hagar." And this was something that was commonly done in that culture. And so Abraham agreed. Hagar conceived, and she was pregnant with a child, and all of a sudden, major amounts of conflict began. And someone's in denial. Here's the verse from Genesis 16:5. "Then Sarai said to Abram, 'You have brought this wrong on me. I allowed my servant to have sexual relations with you, but when she realized that she was pregnant, she despised me. May the Lord judge between you and me.'" And so here we find Sarai in a time of denial, that it was, this was her idea, but she's trying to escape this conflict by denying her part in it. The second way that people use escape is to run. let's continue on in that same story, and we get another idea, we get another picture of this way of dealing with conflict. Genesis 16, Abraham said to Sarai, "Since your servant is under your authority, do to her whatever you think best." Then Sarai treated Hagar harshly, so she ran away from Sarai. The Lord's angel found Hagar near a spring of water in the desert, the spring that is along the road to Shur. He said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She replied, "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai." The angel encourages her that God has his hand on her and his blessing on her, and he encourages her to go back and submit to Sarai. And eventually, well, I wouldn't say that eventually that whole problem got solved. There's actually still conflict going on today. Denial, flight, and to the extreme of suicide, using suicide as a way to escape a conflict, right? King David, when he was chased out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, got away with all of his main advisors and so on. But there was an advisor who stayed behind and who became an advisor to Absalom, and his name was Ahithophel. In 2 Samuel 17, we read part of his story. When Ahithophel realized that his advice to the king had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and returned to his house in his hometown. After setting his household in order, he hanged himself. So he died and was buried in the grave of his father. People use suicide to try to deal with conflict, or to avoid dealing with conflict. To try to escape from conflict, people use denial and flight and suicide. Well, there's another way that people deal with conflict. When, we as believers, we believe that conflict brings with it opportunities to make peace. But there is a second way, a bad way, of trying to deal with conflict that does not make peace. It is attack. Sande says this is used by people who are more interested in winning a conflict than in preserving a relationship. And so, one of the ways of attacking is to assault, either verbally, physically assault. And we turn to the story of Stephen in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, chapter 6. Stephen is a young leader in the church. He's been chosen as one of the deacons, but he's filled with the Spirit of God, and God is using him in amazing ways. But here in Acts 6, there's conflict. Now Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. But some men from the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, as well as some from Cilicia and the province of Asia, stood up and argued with Stephen. Yet they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We've heard this man speaking blasphemous words against Moses and God." And so within this conflict, and within this attack comes assault. Well, they're not done yet, and so we move on to the method of litigation. This is another part of attack, is to take somebody to court or to have some sort of hearing about this conflict that's going on. In Acts 6, going on, verse 12, they incited the people, the elders and the experts in the law. Then they approached Stephen and seized him and brought him before the council. They brought forward false witnesses who said, "This man does not stop saying things against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him saying that Jesus the Nazarene will destroy this place and change the customs that Moses handed down to us." All who were sitting in the council looked intently at Stephen and saw his face was like the face of an angel. So they've moved from assault on Stephen to litigation against Stephen, a court case within the Jewish law, a court case against Stephen in a hearing. Taken to the extreme, this brings murder. Acts 7, when they heard these things, they became furious and ground their teeth at him. Stephen, an aside here is that Stephen has been speaking in his own defense and giving a history lesson. And now God is appearing to him, and he is making some claims that they cannot bear any longer. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked intently toward heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they covered their ears, shouting with a loud voice, and rushed at him with one intent. When they had driven him out of the city, they began to stone him. These are three ways that people try to deal with conflict: assault, litigation, and if nothing else gets resolved, then it's murder. Two bad ways of trying to deal with conflict. But we believe that conflict brings opportunities to make peace. Let's talk about that for a couple of minutes. Sande says that these responses are commanded by God, empowered by the gospel of Jesus, and directed toward finding just and mutually agreeable solutions to your conflict. The first way of doing that is to overlook an offense. Proverbs 19:11 says, "A person's wisdom makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense." A next step would be reconciliation. Matthew 5:23 and 24. "So then, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your gift." And both Matthew 5 and Matthew 18 talk about being reconciled, depending on whose fault it is and so on, but being reconciled together, coming together. Another step then is mediation. If reconciliation cannot take place, then perhaps mediation is needed. Matthew 18 then, "But if he does not listen, if your brother does not listen to you, take one or two others with you, so that at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter may be established." But what if mediation doesn't work? Well, maybe you need at that point someone to come in as an arbitrator in more of a legal sense. 1 Corinthians 6 talks a little bit about this. "When any of you has a legal dispute with another, does he dare go to court before the unrighteous rather than before the saints?" Interesting. "Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you not competent to settle trivial suits? Do you not know that we will judge angels? Why not ordinary matters?" Some interesting revelation there by Paul talking about arbitration and the need for us as believers to come together and judge in these matters. What if arbitration doesn't work? Well, there is within the church the idea of being accountable to each other and being accountable to our elders. And so this is the last step, the idea of, and back to Matthew 18, if he, the one who's offended, if he refuses to listen to them, that is the 3 witnesses, tell it to the whole church. If he refuses to listen to the church, treat him like a Gentile or a tax collector. Ooh, Gentiles and tax collectors, they're way down there, right? Friends, conflict brings opportunities to make peace. What would happen if we were living out the gospel in the conflicts of our daily lives? If we were able to overlook minor offenses, perhaps people would be more willing to admit failures. If we were more inclined toward reconciliation and restoration, perhaps more of us would Be willing to ask for help before a crisis even occurs. What if our families were better equipped to negotiate and to mediate with each other? There would be fewer daily battles and things would be resolved probably within 24 hours. There would be less leaving, less divorce. What if members of the church were encouraged to go to each other to discuss problems instead of letting them grow into bitterness and huge legal battles? Our unity would be protected. Offended members would be less likely to leave. I think for this to happen, we need to understand what the Bible teaches about peacemaking. We need to have faith that biblical principles will actually work in today's culture. We need to believe that we can respond to conflict in a constructive and a helpful way. Trusting Jesus, let us look for practical training and help on personal conflict resolution. And trusting our Father, let us be prepared to assist others who are caught in difficult disputes as well. I want to go back to our beginning story as we come to a close for this message. So the brothers and sister and pastor prayed together and asked God to show them a way. 3 weeks later, the entire extended family gathered together in the banquet room of a local restaurant. Jenny had somehow overcome Frank's fears and persuaded him to leave the house and join the family for dinner. 12 nephews and nieces watched with rapt attention as he walked into the room and nervously sat down at one end of the table. As the eldest son, Joe asked for everyone's attention. "Frank, our family is gathered together today to honor you. For the past 10 years, you devoted yourself to caring for Mom. Today we want to present you with this special plaque. It says, 'To our brother Frank, the best of all sons, who cared for our mother with selfless love and undying devotion. Your companionship filled her life with joy and delight, and was a constant reminder to her of the love of God. With deepest gratitude to a wonderful brother, from Joe, John, Jenny, and Matt.'" Tears welled up in Frank's eyes as Joe handed him the plaque. Before he could speak, Joe handed him an envelope. "Frank," he went on, "in appreciation for all you did for Mom, we want to give you this gift. It is an agreement we have all signed that gives you a life estate in the farmhouse. That means you will be able to stay there as long as you live. We found a buyer who is willing to purchase the rest of the farmland. Ownership of the house will eventually pass to our children. But as long as you want to live there, we want you to know that it is your home." As Frank clutched the envelope, the dam of emotions finally burst. Months of uncertainty and fear gave way to sobs of relief and gratitude. As Joe leaned over and hugged his brother for the first time in years, Joe's teenage son leaned toward his sister and whispered, "Maybe there is a God after all, because there's no way Dad would have done this on his own." You know, you and I can show that there is a God after all by how we respond to conflict. This is a great story, but each one of us have a story of our own that God is writing. My hope and prayer is that as we move through this series about making peace, that we will learn together the importance of it and how God receives amazing glory and we get filled with such joy when we follow his way. Amen.